An official government report from 1863 exists, yet very few people talk about it today. It wasn't written by a treasure hunter or someone attempting to push an extraordinary theory. Instead, it was compiled by government geologist Charles Whittlesey after spending years examining the copper-rich region around Lake Superior. His mission was simple: document what American mining companies were uncovering as they opened new mines throughout Michigan's Upper Peninsula. They expected to discover untouched copper deposits. What they found instead was something far more astonishing. Long before the first American mining companies ever arrived, someone had already mined the area. Not at a single site or on just one occasion, but across an entire region filled with thousands of ancient mine pits, underground tunnels, stone hammers, wooden supports, and evidence of a mining operation so vast that even the engineers who first recorded it struggled to explain who had created it or where the enormous quantity of missing copper had gone. More than 3 decades later, in 1894, another researcher recorded something equally extraordinary. Ojibwe elders told of strangers who had crossed the Great Water, came only in search of copper, worked the mines for generations, and then disappeared. Was this simply an oral tradition, or could it hold the key to solving one of North America's oldest archaeological mysteries? To find the answer, we have to begin where the evidence starts. Not with legends, but with the ancient mines lying hidden beneath the forests surrounding Lake Superior. When American mining companies arrived in Michigan's Upper Peninsula during the 1840s, they believed they were opening one of the last great untouched mineral frontiers in North America. Geological surveys had confirmed that the land surrounding Lake Superior contained some of the richest deposits of native copper ever found. Unlike most copper around the world, which needed to be smelted from ore, much of the copper here existed in its pure metallic form. Prospectors imagined huge fortunes waiting beneath the forests, and investors poured money into what quickly became one of the fastest-growing mining districts in the nation. But it didn't take long for the excitement to turn into confusion. As engineers started clearing land and digging new shafts, they repeatedly came across signs showing they were not the first people to mine these deposits. Across the Quinault Peninsula and the islands of northern Lake Superior, they uncovered ancient excavation pits spread throughout the landscape. Some were shallow depressions almost hidden beneath centuries of forest growth. Others reached dozens of feet into the ground, their walls carved with surprising precision. In many places, enormous trees had grown directly inside abandoned mine pits, their roots twisting around broken rock that had clearly been disturbed long before the forest fully matured. This was not what anyone had expected to discover. The more land they explored, the more these ancient workings appeared. They weren't isolated discoveries made by a single mining company. Different crews working miles apart, often with no connection to one another, reported remarkably similar findings. There were trenches following exposed copper veins, carefully carved drainage channels designed to stop water from flooding the excavations, and piles of waste rock arranged in ways that suggested organized mining instead of casual gathering. Then came the tools. Hundreds of stone hammers started appearing at sites across the region. Most were made from extremely hard volcanic rock, shaped to fit comfortably in the hand and polished smooth from repeated use. Some weighed only a few pounds, while others were so heavy they would have required tremendous strength to swing. Archaeologists would eventually recover thousands of these hammerstones, many still resting exactly where ancient miners had left them beside exposed copper deposits. To 19th century engineers, their presence raised an obvious question. If these mines had been worked using stone tools, who had the knowledge and organization to carry out an operation on this scale? The evidence pointed to far more than occasional visits to collect surface copper. It suggested generations of skilled miners who understood the rock beneath their feet. In several places, researchers discovered clear evidence of a method now called fire setting. Before explosives were invented, miners built large fires directly against the rock face, heating the stone for hours before suddenly cooling it with water. The rapid change in temperature cracked the rock, making it possible to remove large pieces of native copper using surprisingly simple tools. It was an effective technique, but not one discovered by chance. Fire setting required careful planning, practical experience, and an understanding of how different types of stone reacted to heat. It reflected knowledge passed down through many generations, knowledge shared by ancient mining cultures in Europe, the Near East, and, as the evidence suggested, the shores of Lake Superior too. Then, years later, archaeologists started dating the wooden remains preserved inside several of these ancient workings. The results turned an unusual mining story into one of North America's greatest archaeological mysteries. Some of the timber recovered from the old shafts was around 3,000 years old. Other samples proved even older, long before the Roman Empire, long before the Vikings crossed the Atlantic, and in some cases old enough to place these mining operations thousands of years before Europeans reached North America. By then, there was no longer any serious doubt that the mines themselves were ancient. The real mystery had become something much bigger. If people had been mining copper from Lake Superior on this scale for thousands of years, where did it all go? By the time Charles Whittlesey completed his federal survey during the 1860s, one fact had become impossible to overlook. The ancient mines were not small. After years of studying the old workings across the Lake Superior region, Whittlesey estimated that ancient miners had removed between 1.5 and 2 billion pounds of native copper. Modern archaeologists question that figure, arguing it may be too high, but even the most conservative estimates still suggest that hundreds of millions of pounds were extracted over thousands of years. Either way, the scale is astonishing. To understand what that means, consider what archaeologists have actually uncovered across North America. Copper artifacts certainly exist. Beautiful ceremonial objects, tools, fishhooks, spear points, awls, and ornaments have been found at sites stretching from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi Valley. They prove that copper was widely used and traded by indigenous cultures long before Europeans arrived. But there is one problem. The total amount of copper recovered from all those archaeological sites represents only a small fraction of what appears to have been removed from the Lake Superior mines. The numbers simply don't add up. If hundreds of millions of pounds of copper were extracted, where is the rest? Was it melted down and reused across countless generations? Did it disappear through trade networks that archaeologists have not yet completely reconstructed? Or was a large portion carried somewhere far beyond the Great Lakes? That final question has fascinated researchers for more than a century, because solving it doesn't only require explaining the missing copper, it also requires explaining who had the knowledge, organization, and transportation needed to move such enormous amounts of metal in the first place. And that is where the mystery begins to leave the mines and move on to the water. Once researchers accepted that the ancient mines were real, a second question became much harder to ignore. If enormous amounts of copper were removed from the Lake Superior region, how was it transported? Moving a few hundred pounds is one thing. Moving hundreds of millions of pounds over centuries is something completely different. Lake Superior is not a small inland lake. It is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, capable of producing storms powerful enough to sink modern ships. Anyone transporting large amounts of copper would have needed more than simple canoes or temporary rafts. They would have required organized logistics, experienced crews, and vessels capable of carrying heavy cargo across open water again and again. That question becomes even more interesting when you look across the Atlantic. During the European Bronze Age, civilizations produced enormous amounts of bronze for tools, weapons, ceremonial objects, and trade. Bronze is made mainly from copper and tin, and for decades archaeologists have debated whether Europe's known copper sources were enough to meet that demand. While Europe certainly had productive mines, some researchers believe that the scale of Bronze Age metal production raises questions that are still being carefully studied today. In recent decades, scientists introduced another tool into the discussion: isotopic analysis. Because copper forms under different geological conditions, deposits from different regions can sometimes have unique chemical signatures. Researchers have used these signatures to compare ancient copper artifacts with known mining regions around the world. Some studies have suggested similarities between certain artifacts and copper from the Lake Superior region, while others challenge those conclusions and argue that the evidence is still not conclusive. The debate continues, and no broad academic agreement has been reached, but regardless of where that discussion eventually leads, one fact remains unchanged. The ancient mines around Lake Superior existed. The copper was extracted, and a remarkable amount of it has never been fully accounted for. Then, more than 30 years after Charles Whittlesey submitted his federal report, another piece of the puzzle appeared, not from a geologist or a mining engineer, but from the oral history of the people whose ancestors had lived beside those ancient mines for generations. In 1894, a researcher met with Ojibwe elders and carefully recorded what they remembered about the people who came searching for the copper. In 1894, the Wisconsin Historical Society published a collection of Ojibwe traditions recorded from elders whose families had lived around Lake Superior for countless generations. Among those accounts was one that has drawn growing attention from researchers interested in the ancient copper mines. The elders did not describe discovering the mines themselves. They spoke about the people who worked them. According to the account, strangers arrived from the east, crossing the Great Water in large vessels. They were remembered as organized groups who seemed to know exactly where the copper could be found. They did not wander through the forests searching for deposits. They traveled directly to the mining areas, extracted the copper, and returned to the water carrying it. Whether every detail reflects an actual historical event or generations of oral tradition is something historians continue to debate. What makes the account remarkable is how closely several descriptions match archaeological evidence that had already been documented independently. The Ojibwe described fires being built against exposed rock to break it apart before the copper was removed. Long before those traditions were recorded, archaeologists had already identified evidence of fire setting inside many of the ancient mine workings. Burned rock surfaces, ash deposits, and fracture patterns all pointed toward the same mining method. The traditions also describe copper being moved from the mines toward the shoreline, where it was loaded onto waiting vessels. Today, archaeologists know that many of the largest prehistoric mining sites are located only a short distance from the shores of Lake Superior and Isle Royale. While that alone does not prove where the copper ultimately traveled, it does show that transporting heavy material by water would have been the most practical option available. Perhaps the most fascinating part of the Ojibwe account is how it ends. There is no great battle, no catastrophe, no story of the miners suddenly disappearing overnight. Instead, the elders simply recalled that after many years, the strangers finished their work, loaded the last of the copper onto their vessels, and sailed away across the water in the same direction from which they had arrived. Then the lake became quiet again. For generations, that memory survived through oral tradition before finally being written down in 1894. By itself, the testimony does not answer every question surrounding the ancient mines. But when it is placed beside the archaeological evidence, the thousands of mine pits, the stone hammers, the fire setting, and the immense amount of copper that was extracted, it becomes one more piece of a puzzle that historians and archaeologists are still trying to understand. And more than a century after those words were first recorded, the central mystery remains exactly the same. More than a century and a half has passed since Charles Whittlesey walked along the shores of Lake Superior, documenting what American mining companies were uncovering beneath the forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. During that time, technology has completely transformed archaeology. Excavations have become far more precise. Radiocarbon dating has allowed researchers to determine the age of ancient wooden mine supports with remarkable accuracy. Geological analysis has revealed how the copper formed millions of years before humans ever arrived. Every generation has brought improved tools and new methods for studying the past. Yet, despite all of that progress, the central mystery remains surprisingly unchanged. No one questions that the ancient mines exist. Thousands of prehistoric excavation pits have been documented across the Keweenaw Peninsula and on Isle Royale. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of hammerstones shaped from hard volcanic rock, many still resting beside exposed copper veins where they were last used. Burned rock surfaces and layers of charcoal continue to provide evidence that ancient miners used fire setting to fracture solid stone long before explosives existed. The archaeological evidence for large-scale prehistoric copper mining is not controversial. It has been studied for generations and continues to be investigated today. The unanswered questions begin only after that point. Who organized such an enormous mining operation? How was knowledge of techniques like fire setting developed and passed from one generation to the next? How many people worked these mines across the centuries? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, what happened to the copper? Even if the highest 19th century estimates are reduced considerably, the scale of extraction remains extraordinary. It represents an amount of metal that would have required planning, labor, transportation, and organization over an extremely long period of time. Whatever happened at Lake Superior was not the work of a handful of individuals collecting surface nuggets. It was a long-running mining industry unlike anything most people imagine when they think about prehistoric North America. This is why the 1894 Ojibwe account continues to capture attention. Not because it proves every theory that has been suggested, it doesn't. Oral traditions preserve memories across generations, but like all historical sources, they must be examined alongside archaeology, geology, and the broader historical record. What makes the account remarkable is that it describes people who came specifically for copper, knew exactly where to find it, used methods that closely resemble those identified by archaeologists, and eventually departed across the water after their work was complete. Whether those details preserve an exact historical memory or a tradition shaped over centuries is something historians continue to investigate. And that is where the story becomes so compelling. The archaeological record preserves the mines. The 19th century surveys preserved the observations of the first modern engineers who studied them. The Ojibwe preserved a memory of the people they believed had worked there. Each source reveals part of the story. None reveals all of it. History is rarely solved by one single discovery. Instead, it is pieced together step by step, document by document, excavation by excavation. Sometimes a forgotten government report changes how we view an old landscape. Sometimes an archaeological excavation confirms what earlier generations only suspected. And sometimes an oral tradition survives long enough to raise questions that modern research is only beginning to explore. Perhaps future excavations around Lake Superior will uncover new evidence that reshapes what we know about these ancient mines. Perhaps advances in archaeological science will answer questions that have remained unsolved for more than a century. Or perhaps some parts of this story have already vanished forever, leaving only fragments scattered through old reports, museum collections, and memories that were carefully recorded before they disappeared. Whatever the final answer may be, one fact stands beyond dispute. Long before the first American mining companies reached the shores of Lake Superior, long before Charles Whittlesey submitted his federal report, and long before the 1894 Ojibwe account was written down, someone was mining copper here on an extraordinary scale. Who those miners were, how their operation was organized, and where so much of that copper ultimately ended up remain among the most fascinating questions in North American archaeology. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through original records, archaeology, and historical evidence. And before you leave, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Who do you think the Ojibwe were remembering when they spoke about the strangers who came for the copper? And what do you believe happened to the metal they carried away? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nature Mystery Unravel Mysteries, learn untold tales of history, and stay in the exciting world of new discoveries.